that have been tasked to industrialize and expand economy of this country. You go and pull out their financial, you're going to find that they are spending 80% of their annual budget in procuring land. That money was supposed to go towards industrialization and developing so that you can create employment for the people. But you must spend that money buying land from people that never bought the land. This is where the government is saying that when there is land that is not used, they can expropriate for government use in such areas, so that instead of spending, say, $2 billion in procuring this land, you can use that money towards the actual cause, which is building something that is going to benefit the people in that area. By so doing, you also begin to depopularize the so-called urban areas that you're speaking about, because you're building new areas where you are industrializing. There will be financial institutions that are going to support the new cities that are going to be coming in. You begin to depopularize and you're dealing with poverty. So this is what is it, and this is not new. If you know the history, you know that Singapore had to expropriate the land. You can go and read about the Singapore Land Acquisition Ordinance of 1982 and the Land Acquisition Act of 1960. You can go and do a study on Norway on how Statoil Hydro and Statoil control 51%
But
of
PK, do you
any
believe that
entity
there
that
should be
goes around in
compensation
gas
then
industry.
for expropriating land, or do you think that the government should just expropriate without any compensation?
Look, I'm caught in between there, because if it was me, I would tell you that without compensation, because this land was never bought. In fact, it was acquired by blood. But our constitution does allow for a fair what you call a compensation. It does allow that. So the government is going to follow that route. But if it was up to me, this shouldn't be it should be without any compensation. They never bought this land. We are still hurt, and them downplaying that history, and that it affects us, that whenever we have cultures here, whenever I want to go to the graves and speak to my ancestors, I can't, because AAA beef is farming over my forefathers' land there, right? And I will be shot and called that they thought I was a monkey when I was going to that particular land. This lady, yes, Saxon speaks about that their family. I want you to go and check a guy called Rudy Kerik, who was arrested in the area called Fixbeck. It's white farmers, Afrikaners eliminating each other. That guy linked to about 7 farm murders. They come and blame it on the people. You go and research about a guy called Eugene Terebranch, who was killed by black boys after multiple times of him sodomizing them, treating them like trash in those farms. When they retaliate, they come and call it farm murders. These guys here. There is also another one who was just recently arrested, a fiance planning an assassin of a husband who is also a farmer in Malitswai. That was going to be called a racial farm attack again. This is what they do. They eliminate each other. They treat workers bad. Workers can go months without being paid by them in these farmers, and then get up being strangled. I mean, I think you've seen a video of them having a coffin in a farm. Right, a coffin, putting a young boy in a coffin, threatening to bury him, and taking a video, and that raises question to say that how many people
is reflective of the broader systemic challenges, right? I'm glad we got you up, because you've given, I think, some very important and apt points that challenge some other points that have been made as well, and I think it broadly enriches the conversation. But I do want to get to another voice that was requested by some people in the audience, if that's all right with you. But appreciate you coming and joining us, and I want you to stick around so we can circle back. But Rutendo, I know you had your hand raised and you were reacting to some other speakers earlier on in the conversation. So I'd love to pass the mic to you so you can share your perspective.
Thank you so much. And we appreciate the opportunity that you've caused a discussion of this magnitude. I've heard Mario having discussions about South Africa, and I think this platform might be able to shed a bit of light to some of the issues we're talking about. So I've heard people like Joost and I think also Alex Newman misrepresenting information and giving the impression and obfuscating issues and also mixing issues. One of the biggest issues that they mixed is the aspect of corruption in South Africa and the ANC government. Now, if we look at the definition of corruption as a misappropriation of public interest or public resources for private interests of individuals, then we have to accept that the biggest corruption that ever happened in South Africa has to be the dispossession of Black people of their land by white settlers. It's the biggest corruption that continues to benefit the scoin or the children of those settlers who continue to use this land as collateral. They continue to use this land to be productive in agricultural terms. And it's not only farming land that they stole, they also stole urban land, which happens to constitute about 60% of the value of land in South Africa. No one wants to talk about that as the biggest form of corruption that is worth trillions. And it is worth trillions because there is a multiplier effect in that there's a banking system that benefits from lending farmers who are controlling the stolen land loans to make developments and to vandalize the very same land that they do not own. That has to be the biggest form of corruption that has got a conspiracy behind it of companies, banks, financial institutions, and insurance companies, which are the people that are fighting and resisting this corruption. Land return to the people. Now, why do we say that the land cannot legally belong to white people? Because they were Africans that were sitting on that land. How do we know? We know that when Bartolomeu Diaz, the Portuguese, came to discover the Cape or South Africa, they landed in 1485. And when they got there, they were resisted by the Khoisan and some Xhosa-speaking people in the area. They even named that area Dos Venquiros in traditional Portuguese that actually meant the land of Black people. So there's an acceptance in the writings of the Portuguese that there were Black people there. And when Diaz failed to settle in the Cape, he sent de Almeida in 1496 to actually come with an armada and a military to come and forcibly establish what is called a padrao that was required, or a cross that was required in the law of discovery to ensure that Europeans have discovered the piece of land. The Khoisan who were there fought de Almeida. De Almeida died in that fight, and that defense that stopped the Portuguese from discovering South Africa was an illustration that not only.
But Rutendo, I understand, and so, but I think the issue I'm running into, because I mean, I understand there's a historical grievance, and in every local, regional, whatever country, you can go back, and I understand, fine, but the question now becomes the fact of the matter of now. And so the question then becomes, it goes back to this idea of, and I fail to understand how this specific law that is being put in place. And the question then is, because I think there's a broad understanding, like it or not, that governments, even the United States, can expropriate land with compensation, right? The federal government in the United States has those rights. The question then becomes here specifically related to South Africa, is there's this idea and this notion that the land issue and the way it's being framed is this is the solution, which number one, doesn't address the already 20 plus year in power, almost 30 years now that the ANC has been in power, right? So it hasn't really addressed it, then actually 30 years, that the ANC has been in power, has not been able to address this issue of income inequality. But then two, I still don't understand how, and nobody has been able to say it specifically, what's the plan after the land expropriation? There hasn't been a detailed plan on how the ANC and the South African government specifically is going to put systems and policies in place to address income inequality that is affecting disproportionately Black South African Americans in urban areas. Because then the idea is, well, we'll expropriate the land and then we can develop it and then we can encourage, quote unquote, Black South Africans to go to these areas. That's a 10, 15-year plan then. That's not going to address the concerns at the moment of right now. And if anything, without a solid anti-corruption plan in place, without an anti, it just ripe of already a big problem of South African corruption, which you may disagree with, but it's there clear as day. The issue of expropriating land without compensation, without a robust judiciary, is going to make corruption, if anything, worse in South Africa, not better.
Well, the context I was trying to create is that there is no title or faultless title in the hands of white people. Because first of all, the land that they took when it was under African people who had the initial property rights was never for sale. Africans never believed in taking public goods and making them private property. So the aspect that there are people who hold African land as private property is already an abrogation of the original property rights of African people who believed in holding that land in custodianship. So these white people that are holding the land cannot be entitled to compensation when they're holding on to stolen land or when they bought stolen land, which should be sequestrated and brought back to its original owners, and the unjust wealth that was made of that land given to the people that lost it in the first place in an illegal principle that is known in America, in Europe, in South Africa as restitutio in integrum. The fact that we're discussing compensation for land that these settlers stole, it's an absolute absurdity. But Americans support that absolute absurdity because America, in its own respect, is not a democracy. It is a colony of Anglo-Saxons that have colonized Indian land and have killed off the Indian land so that they could own the land. So this is why the arbiters of this kind of issue cannot be Americans, because they are colonizers in their own respect. They have not respected the property rights of American.
I get it, but it's you can argue as much as you want, but not even Nelson Mandela did this when he came into power.
And that's why Nelson Mandela.
There was a general understanding. There was an understanding that the law is the law and private property exists.
But what is
that
the law?
Even the South African Supreme Court and the justice system developed recognizes.
But
so you can go back as much as you want to argue how that's an aberration. But the fact of the matter of where we are right now is South Africa's government recognizes private property. Really? And to make an argument against it, now I think it's too late. How does this issue of land appropriation going to address the specific issues of income inequality affecting Black South African American South Africans that are mostly in urban settings? That is where I think it is. And if I may, let me just, because Apostle, I want to go to you for this then. Because you're waving your hand. I think this is the issue that I want to get at from that aspect. Is again, South Africa's laws recognize private property. You can argue for or against it, but that's the law. How does
Victoria, can I argue my point out and then
argue. Finish your point, and then I'm going to Apostle. Go ahead.
Okay. So what I was trying to put across is, yes, South Africa does look at property rights, but when you go to the Constitution, it also therefore respects the property rights that existed before the settlers, especially after 1913. That is why they're saying we can expropriate land without compensation or with just compensation, but we're going to first of all look at what is the property being used for, how was the property acquired in the first place, and also was the people who had the land assisted by the state to have this land? Because you have to understand, a lot of the property that is being held by many white South Africans was given to them by the apartheid government just before it got out of power, or it was sequestrated stolen from Black people who have the first right to compensation for the land that they lost, or restitution, which means a return of that land and should be the return of the unjust enrichment of land that they were taken off after 1913. And this is where a lot of people don't understand that the ANC, from a legal perspective, has every right to sequestrate land that was not acquired correctly and land that did not have faultless title. And most white people will have a very difficult time proving that the land they control is land that they acquired justly and have faultless title. Because when you have stolen property, you can never have that stolen property get what we call proper title, because at no point does the law legalize an illegality.
So Rutendo, let me jump in then, because I want to frame this slightly differently. I do want to get to some of the other speakers. Your points are valid, and I think it's worth exploring them. So, we've seen what happens in Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. when we've seen, quite extreme methods by which to redistribute land or assets and so on. But as I've already pointed out earlier on in the conversation, we're seeing a opposing force develop in the form of these specific communities. I'm not going to say white only again, because I appreciate that was something that just differed with. So how do we find a middle ground here? Because we've got reactionary movements which are very extreme on one side, but we've got policies which might be seen by some communities as quite extreme on the other side. So how do we make a sort of, I don't know, moderate pathway forward?
I think what we need to do is we need to look at international practice. What happened in other cases, like for instance with the Jews when they lost property to the Germans, how was that handled? And we need to look at land redistribution in Japan. There was reparations and restoration of stolen property to other communities, which is being denied to Africans. In the Zimbabwe scenario, what happened is the Zimbabwean government wanted to do this by the book. That's why they took 20 years to do it. The people got fed up. And when the people got fed up, they simply invaded the farms. When they did that, even though the government wanted to do this legally, it became very difficult for the government to actually send soldiers or police to take those people out or to kill those people to take them off from the land. That's why eventually this land reform became a people-driven land reform. And just for the record, one of the major reasons I came here is that there is this consistent narrative that Zimbabwe cannot feed itself. Zimbabwe is wheat self-sufficient right now. Zimbabwe has broken all records for cotton, broken records for sugarcane, tobacco, and many other things by putting this farming in Black people's hands. Not only that, they were able to use that land as collateral for other things like mining. Hence, the biggest Black miners currently in Southern Africa are Zimbabweans, platinum miners, Zimbabweans, and the biggest farmers, Black farmers in the region are Zimbabweans. So the narrative continues to be a propaganda to scare South Africans not to take their land. But Zimbabweans have never starved, even though they were put under sanctions for 24 years to ensure that their land reform didn't fail. But that land reform did not fail. The mining industry is booming because land is in Black hands. They can collateralize it, get loans, and they can go and do other industrial activities. We've now got the biggest steel plant in Africa, in Zimbabwe, because of some of these developments. But nobody talks about it because the propaganda must say Zimbabwe is failing due to taking land, which is not true.
Thank you for that, Rutenda. I think that there is, I've read a lot into Zimbabwe's history recently. I visited there several years ago, and it was very interesting to appreciate how the country has changed. But I would also say that the individual who was so pivotal in some of those major changes also then became one of the greatest, opponents of the people, right? Mugabe is not exactly someone who's been remembered in modern recent times as very popular among some communities. But I did want to go back to you, Palumba.
Before you go, Pyro, I just wanted to say that I put a video up there that I explained the Expropriation Act a little bit more for a bit more detail and nuance to people that might not understand it. I've put it at the top there.
Thank you very much. I think we might have put it into the comments because we tried to keep the nest relatively free. Otherwise, the space can glitch like hell. But we've put it in the comments, I think. So if people do check that out, and I encourage you to look at it. But Philani, I want to come back to you because you had some very insightful thoughts at the beginning of the space, and you have perhaps a difference of opinion to both sides on this.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to respond to this gentleman. This gentleman who just spoke now, and the previous one, I think it was TK, and then there's another EFF guy. They all advocate for the same, they're on the same side. Now, I want to be clear here. There's no land issue in South Africa, right? In South Africa, there's no land issue. And here's why I say that. That is because, firstly, when you look at the surveys that have been done, there have been surveys done by the first one. The first one is by the Institute of Race Relations. The second one is even by Barometer. They've done these surveys. And the land does not come as a priority among South Africans. These are people who have been surveyed. Many of them, of course, the majority is Black people. When these people are being surveyed, the land is not even in the top 3, in the priority list. It's not there. People, they want jobs. They want service delivery in their communities. They want to be safe. There are high levels of crime in the country. There is none. The land issue, people, is not a priority for people. This thing is made up by politicians and by zealots that you are hearing here, pushing a certain political agenda. Now, that's the first thing. So it's a surveys. where people are saying land is not a big issue to them. They care more about jobs, right? The second one is we've heard some of the speakers here, including Martin, they touched on the restitution process, right? Or the program we have heard since the 1990s in this country, where people, they are basically claiming the people who dispossessed land, Black people, before 1994. They filed a claim and then the government addresses that. And guess what? Most of those land issues have been resolved. The total number, right, of the claims that came through from Black people who were dispossessed of land before 1994, the government has addressed that. A few years back, about 4,000 farms were in the hands of government, right? The government could not do the transfer because they were struggling to find people who are going to farm. These are thousands of farms that the government was struggling to transfer. So I'm trying to say to look at the facts. Don't look at the dogma and the data. The dogma and the ideology of who took what when. The question is what matters to South Africans right now. You have this view that Black people, I'm Black, I'm from KwaZulu-Natal. I grew up in the rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal. I grew up in the townships of KwaZulu-Natal. People there, they want to talk about jobs, they want to talk about business, they want to talk about education, they want to talk about, is the bridge working in their community, right? The idea that Black people are obsessed with land, it's something that is made up, right? Even look at, there are some anecdotal, things that have been done by the media. I've seen some of the interviews where they ask Black people, should even race-based policy be pursued 30 years into our democracy? People say no, right? When they ask people as to what matters to you right now in your community, they did that just before the election next year, right? So last year, they went to Richards Bay, in KwaZulu-Natal, my province. They asked people there, what should be the priority as we head to the election? People spoke about business. They spoke about job creation. They spoke about safety in their communities. Nobody said we lack land. The issue is land. It's stopping us from progressing as Black people. So all this thing is made up, right? Now, second thing I want to say, right? I don't want to speak for too long. There is this notion that the problems of Black people, I've been hearing the speakers who have been speaking here. They are saying that the root cause is land. That is why Black people are at the bottom. No, that is total nonsense, right? The issue is things like bad educational outcomes in Black communities, right? Black people are the ones who have bad educational, bad education, who get bad education in this country. Broken families, it's a serious problem, right? At least about 70% of Black kids, they're not growing up with their fathers. So the Black family has collapsed, right? So we have a failing government that fails on crime. We have dismal economic growth. We haven't grown at about 2% for more than 10 years now. We have dismal economic growth in this country. And
so, Philani, can I ask you a question on that point? Because
yes.
it kind of returns back to what I put forward to one of the other speakers before. Again, I appreciate it's slightly different, but the premise is that instead of simply giving land to communities that feel that they've lost it, a form of reparations, reparations should be done in a different form, a better education, better opportunities. Is that what you're saying? Instead of just giving sort of a free loaded gift or something like that? Would I be fair in saying that suggestion?
Yes, because it's not what people are concerned about on the ground. The surveys are showing that people, they care more about education, service delivery, and so on, safety in their communities. They are not saying that the big issue is the land. We don't have land to farm. We don't have land to do this. That's not a priority according to the surveys. This thing is pushed by politicians who have an agenda to divide our country along racial lines, and then, of course, to spite the white population of this country, right? Because at the end of the day, at the core of it's the 21st century. This 1920s mentality that land is what's going to bring us prosperity. We have countries built on deserts, right? We have countries that are being driven by technology as the biggest contributor in their GDP, right? So now you are telling me that we as South Africans now, the land will be the savior. The land is what's going to make us, to be richer. That is it doesn't make any economic sense at all. Even the last year's Nobel economists, years back, they wrote a paper looking at Africa's poverty. They didn't say that the problem is land in Africa. They say it comes down to good policy. It comes down to institutions, right? So this land thing is made up, fabricated to do what? To spite the white population, because to leftists and the EFF and other people who are on the far left, they we must always blame white people. It's the white people, when the government has been failing for 30 years.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the nuance there. What we're going to do is probably, because this is a topic which carries a lot of historical significance, we're probably going to get through some of the hands that are on stage, and then we may revisit this. Sure, Trump will have more comments about it. It'll be in the news cycle again, and we'll rehost it, unless there's some really pressing developments. But we'll probably get through some of the main hands on stage and come back to this topic. But I do want to get to you, Apostle, because I know you're waving frantically, and we promised we'd get to you earlier. And then I want to go to Juiced, Robert, Saxon, and I see we have Mudge raised her hand as well. Go ahead, Apostle.
No, thank you kindly. Perhaps we must ask this Phumlani individual as to say that if land is not as important, then why whites are holding on to their land and opposing it this much? But I want to also challenge him because he's telling lies here, and I don't know why he finds sophistication in lying. One, the Constitutional Review Committee in South Africa conducted public hearings in 2018 and equally in 2021. These are separate public consultations where overwhelmingly South Africans told them that they want land expropriation without compensation. That is why now the 6th Parliament of South Africa moved to the adoption of the Section 25 of the Constitution to allow for expropriation without consultation, without compensation rather. So I don't know where he gets an idea that the people of South Africa do not value or want their land. It's lie. It's some survey that he did with his fellow white community, and he wants to impose that in South Africa. This was a Constitutional Review Committee. And there was an earlier question when Rutendo was making his submission to say that why do we need to change the law? The Constitution of South Africa, but then we are not expecting Americans to understand this. The Constitution of South Africa itself, one, indicates that it can be amended at any given time to execute the will of the people, because the law is mainly supposed to be the will of the people. So if the people are saying that we want to expropriate our land, because look, land is not just the soil that you see. Where do you industrialize? Where do you build industries? It's on the land. Where do you get the minerals that are making the jobs which he's saying South Africans want? When you build state capacity, you can't do that if you do not have the land. You need the land for you to build industries, to manufacture goods. The American society is thriving on the very same minerals that which they are stealing from South Africa, because they have their Lonmin mines. The jobs that he's speaking about that are coming from the mines where our people are not even paid enough. It's on the land. Who owns this particular land? It's not the government. It's not black people. It's not majority of black people in South Africa. So the resolve on land means that the economy, the jobs that he's speaking about, the dysfunctionality of families, the poverty lines, and the inequality within the South African population would be resolved when you resolve the land question. That is why, as the EFF, we say that when you expropriate land, you put it under state custodianship, so that the state can, the state capacity to create millions of jobs can therefore be expanded. That's how you'd be able to grow the economy and provide the necessary jobs. He's speaking about the schools and that black schools are not better than white, because there was law, again, which was passed to subjugate black people to an inferior education called Bantu education that did not give them a quality education and opportunities to participate meaningfully in the economy. The ANC, in as much as one would want to then shift and speak about corruption, like I've indicated earlier, corruption is a global phenomenon that which is not unique to the ANC government. But we are saying that if you are going to build equal schools that actually are across, they are not segregated to say that the inferior education must therefore be reserved for blacks and then a superior education for white. You are going to then fix the imbalances of the past, and you will equally be able to produce meaningful skills that are needed to drive the economy. So if you refuse with the land, you are saying that the economy must continue to be racially excluded to the majority of whites who will come here, tell us that land is not important, that we should be creating jobs, yet they are holding that particular land. So the question that we must ask is, if land is not as important, if land does not produce the minerals, if land does not produce the jobs, why hold on to that particular land? We have the AGOA, where only 22 companies in South Africa are actually in partnership with America. Go look at the composition of those companies. It's all white because of the farming opportunities that they have with America. Hence, they go and make noise in America and claim that they have been killed, that there's genocide that is taking place in South Africa, which is completely false. And then you have your people like Saxon who would come up here and lie that they are being tortured when they have killed people like Matlomola Mosweu. They've killed many that which TK has equally spoken to on the farms. They have tortured our people. But also the history that which you refuse us to visit will expose how our land was taken from them. We want to do it constitutionally. To ask us, but you failed in the past 30 years, I think it's been really myopic, but equally not realistic, because the Constitution has its own clause. And the last point, by the way, the same law that which you want to refer us to indicates that government can take it can take the land for public use. So there is compensation that keeps happening under the very same constitution, which has not disturbed the means of production and the ownership. So we are saying that it cannot continuously be that Black people are treated as foreigners in their own land. They are subjugated to poverty. It can't be correct. So we are addressing.
I hear you. I hear you, Apostle.
We are
thank
going
you.
to a perfect end.
Thank you
Without
for that. No, appreciate it. You've had. I want to make sure that people in the audience. I think it can be fair that Apostle has made some very valid points and spoken a fair amount tonight. So none of the criticisms of the space. I think we've had a very fair space tonight. But I do want to go to the Kifness, who I believe you have maybe a different perspective, and you were raising your hand and lowering it, so I felt like you were reacting. So let's go to you, and then I do want to hear from Mudge as well. But go ahead, Cliff.
Thank you so much for having me. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is David Scott, otherwise known as the Kifness. I'm a musician here in South Africa and a YouTuber. I started pretty much during COVID. I had about 3,000 subscribers. I started making political sort of satire music, which got me in trouble with the media and politicians here. But I moved away from that, started remixing people and animals from around the world. And I'm proud to say that I've now got 3 million subscribers. I'm the third South African to reach that number, third to Tyler and Die Antwoord. So, yeah, I've been very lucky. I've worked flipping hard, I must say. But I'm at a point now in my career where, I don't rely on the sort of traditional gatekeepers of radio and media support and all that kind of thing. So I'm lucky that I get to speak my mind on these things. So yeah, I just want to say that I'm frankly tired of hearing from these EFF losers. Like, that's all I have to say. I just want to remind you guys that on the 16th of December 2019, Malema said, in the next 5 years, if we have not built a school, don't elect any of us. We are useless. That was 5 years ago. Has he built a school? No. And at the end of the day, you can talk about history, you can talk about whatever you want. If your leaders cannot build stuff, they are useless. And that's exactly what Malema has proved to us in his own words, that he is useless. He hasn't built a school. He can't build one school, and yet you guys seem to support him. Luckily, his support is dwindling. And even though he's singing "Kill the Boer" and he's in the international spotlight at the moment, I think most of us can agree that he's a loser. He can't do anything. And at the end of the day, we can talk about land and all this stuff, but it's literally a battle between those who can do stuff and those who can't. And as a passionate South African and as someone who pays tax out of my ears, all I want is for my tax money to go towards education and giving people the best possible chance of making the most of their lives. That's all I want. I'm a peace-loving South African. I love people of all races. I don't care what color you are. I've worked with, musicians, regardless of their race or background. I work with them on merit, and that's all that counts. So that's all I have to say.
So let me go to Mudge. You haven't had a chance to speak yet. I don't believe you've spoken else. So I want to give you an opportunity to give you the mic. Go ahead.
Good evening. I hope I'm clear. I just want to be
yes, perfectly. You're good.
Yeah, very brief. First of all, I want to point out it's something that probably might seem a little bit controversial. I'm well aware that there are white settlers who moved into South Africa and have acquired the status of being called Afrikaners. But at the same time, you don't find Black people moving into Europe, or if they move to Germany, they will be called Germaniers or they will be called Netherlanders. I just want to point that out. The second thing is, when people move or settle somewhere, those who move to South Africa actually have now their own language, which is concorded with other language. But even today, there's somebody who lied and said that language is native to Africa, whereas it's a Germanic language. So we're actually being very economical with the truth. That's point one. So if you're in here as a Caucasian, really get to know that whereas it might be justified, the privilege and arrogance of shouting, I'm an Afrikaner, but there's nobody else who's saying, I'm a Netherlander, I'm a Germani, I'm an Amerikaner, just for the fun of it. I don't want to step onto somebody. I just want to say this as it is out there. I don't have to be right, and I just want to put it out there. Now, the second thing, I wanted to explain a point that Rutendo tried to bring out, and this might not be clear to many people. There are constitutions that really are valid as we speak, but there are traditional methods of acquiring land or even distributing land. So you find that in very traditional setups in Africa, it's sufficient for Mario, for example, if your mother is tilling a land somewhere, your father would just need to point that land and say, that's your land. And that is legal. And that will never be really overtaken by any constitution. This is the African setup in some African, setup, so to say. So I just wanted to say that the current constitution of many African countries do not necessarily overrule some of them if they're positive, of course. And at this point, I want to also remind that the constitution that the most progressive in Africa is the South African one. Now that I move to the next point about whether the land should be given back with compensation or not. So basically what I feel is that the country as it is needs to reconcile because the hate that's brewing out here. The Chief Ness has just said, that he's talking about his country, but how he's describing his people, you see, you just see the stereotype coming out. And sorry to give you example because you just spoke before me. I don't want to put you in a spotlight. But what's going on is that, unfortunately, there's a lot of hate. I've met people who are really telling me openly, I hate those people. And I was like, why? And they want to be one country. So what really should also be done, there needs to be a reconciliation. And when there is a reconciliation, then you can find better ways of solving these issues. We shouldn't have people who want to call themselves South African, but then they come and say, we are Afrikaners, and no, we want to have our own Oranian. Go have it in the Netherlands there. And no. So you're bringing a lot of problems their children who are going to be born today, they don't know about that hate. You're going to be really, force them to take over the hate. That is not working that way. I'm really so sorry to just bring it out like that, but the problems are deep inside. I don't know if many of you here have had people who are just openly saying they hate each other. Now, that having been said, I just want to point out again that coexistence is very important, because then you know, this is my country, this is my blood, And another thing is that, like you see that I'm explaining to those who probably have never been to the African continent, there are, for example, I'll give an example with New York, for example. So you find that the town of New York would then have that the name itself is like the name of the forefather, So you can count until today who's the son of who and who's the daughter of who. And that's why sometimes there's a lot of emotion around land. This is something that if you are in Germany, now, when you ask somebody, well, are you from Stuttgart? They tell you, well, they don't even have, from the European perspective, they don't have that kind of connection with land. Yes, thanks so much for the opportunity. Thanks for taking the time to host this space. I'd like, with your permission, to just say that we're also going to be hosting in the same topic on Saturday. So those who want to join, just feel free to check it out and join us. Back to you.
Thank you very much for those important points. And I think we'll be doing ourselves another space as well. And for people who've been enjoying this space, or maybe have been frustrated at times, but still it's a fair effort to cover this complicated matter, then check out the resources above, follow anyone who's resonated with you, the hosts, and so on. But Ronaldo, I wanted to come to you because I was recommended by a few speakers to hear from you. And what's your perspective on everything you've heard tonight and the topic as usual?
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for having this space, and how's it to everybody. You see, I think throughout this discussion tonight, we've seen what the problem is. It's the fact that we are living in the past, we are focusing in the past, and we're not looking towards the future, because we are still playing this silly game of who's to blame. Now, we live in a society where atrocious things have happened in our past. And I think we're all aware of that. And the problem that we are facing as a country today is that people aren't looking towards the future. They aren't focusing on what is better for South Africa. It's a type of revenge game that is being played by the ANC government. Also broader to that, I mean, some of the previous speakers have spoken at least about land from the 1600s. Now, there's a Restitution of Land Rights Act that was signed in 1994 and has been updated in 2014. And that is legislation of South Africa that you can go and verify. That pretty much spoke about, those who wanted land could get land, and those that wanted, to rather get compensated for it, they could get compensation. And the vast majority took that, the second part of compensation. Now, as a former member of parliament, I've also experienced both the aspect of the double standards of racism in this country. And if you look at what Julius Malema has said in the past, and it started in 2010 when he's saying, kill the boot, kill the farmer, for the first time in an open space. And that was still when he was the youth leader of the African National Congress, along with the president, Jacob Zuma, at the time, that sang that. Now, the point that I'm making here is, recently, when I was elected to parliament, there was a smear campaign that was launched by, I would say, a media house that obviously now has been exposed for being a leftist organization funded by, dodgy characters that owe people money. But irrespective of that, the people that want to voice the issues that's best for South Africa are the ones being targeted in South Africa. The double standard, of course, being that I was kicked out of parliament for showcasing the double standard of racism by talking about how Julius Malema in 2010 sang, kill the boot, kill the farmer. Now, for a lot of South Africans today, you look at that, and what you see is that it's an average song. People are used to it now because it's 25 years since we became a democracy. But remember, in 2010, this was the first time it was sang publicly. Now, a lot of people were outraged that he was taken to court, eventually not found guilty of hate speech, even though, the actual title is "Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer," and then the intimidation tactics that came around that. Now, the double standard, of course, is that he was found not guilty of hate speech, and currently he is a member of parliament and the leader of the fourth biggest political party in South Africa. And I, who used hyperbole to showcase how a person would feel if the roles were reversed and if a different song was sung, and then a derogatory term for a black individual were used, then of course, what would happen? And here we are, 25 years later, and we found the answer to that there is a double standard when it comes to racism in South Africa. Now, the broader picture that we need to focus on, and that many people aren't focusing on in South Africa, is where does the legacy of apartheid end, and where does the failure by the ANC government begin? Because a lot of people that you heard tonight spoke about how frustrated they are and how what needs to be given back and why it needs to be given back. The question that you need to ask yourself is, the ANC has been in government of this country for 31 years, over 3 decades. Imagine if the Republicans or if the Democrats in the United States had control for that long, what would happen? Now, that is the case in South Africa, where we have a one-party state for 31 years that failed to deliver almost on every single promise. And because of that, people are upset and people are angry, but what they are not doing is blaming the right individuals. And that is why this narrative, specifically by the EFF and by MK, has risen, where it's white monopoly capital. That was debunked many years ago as, I can't remember what, it's Bell Pottinger, the Bell Pottinger campaign that bankrupted that company in the UK. And this narrative, to this day, is still being driven. White monopoly capital, and how white people are to blame for everything that's wrong in this country. And unfortunately, the ANC is using it to their advantage. And now, because the EFF and the MK are gaining momentum again in South Africa, because the biggest political party that stole votes away from the ANC, that caused them for the first time in our democracy to fall under 50%, was the MK party. Now, the MK is quite radical. I would say as equally radical as the EFF, with singing songs about killing people and, wanting land at all costs, and that, expropriation without compensation. So the ANC has now suddenly decided to pass these policies because of the fact that they are aware that they are losing support, because a lot of their voters want them to be more radical.
So Ronaldo, just to jump in on this point then, because as we begin to probably wind down for this this session, but we'll definitely be back to return, and many more speakers and many more opportunities for people to speak. How simply then would you let's shift away from the the problems to solutions, right? When the South African election occurred and I saw the result, and I was, wow, the ANC have lost their majority for the first time since they took power, and they're now in a grand coalition, grand unity government with the DA and others. Like, what the heck's going on? So, why can't we see, and what would it take to move more constructively forward, not just in this land reform, but about, which is obviously the bigger systemic issue of racial inequality and such within South Africa? What would you say in a quick hot take?
The simple solution is to actually work with the GNU partners. The ANC still think that they are in government and in control. And there's no opposition in South Africa at the moment. The opposition used to be the Democratic Alliance. They are now part of the GNU. And the actual opposition is the EFF and the MK. And the policies that is currently being passed by the GNU is exactly the policies that the EFF and the MK want to pass. So it's very important that we need to realize that it falls on civil society at the moment to be the opposition. And that I think is why the whole Trump situation and the announcement of it couldn't come at a better time, where South Africa is at a crossroads. So if the situation with the Trump administration just puts a spotlight on South Africa so that people can investigate for themselves what a lot of South Africans have been saying for well over a decade now, you'll find that the solution to South Africa's problem is to start blaming the people that need to be blamed for it, which is the ANC government, and then to look at what caused the failure of South Africa previously, which was racial laws and the ill treatment of people based on the color of their skin. Now, there's a very easy solution, a quick solution that the ANC government can do overnight, and that is repeal the 142 race laws. And in order to still assist the previously disadvantaged, you base it on economic standing and not on race. Because then the vast majority of people that will benefit in this country will still be Black individuals, but you won't overlook the minority groups. You won't overlook the white people, colored people, Indian people. And that is a very quick solution. The other situation that we could look at to improve this country immediately is there's two big issues in this country: unemployment and crime. We've got 80 murders a day in this country, and we have got a youth unemployment rate that is close to 60%. Now, for a population of 64 million people, how many police officers do you think there are? There's only 170,000 police officers in total. In total, that includes administrative staff. And the answer is right in front of everybody. We've got an unemployment problem and we've got a crime problem. So take the unemployed, train them, make them police officers, and immediately overnight, you've not only created jobs, but you've reduced the unemployment rate in this country. Those two things alone will put South Africa on an economic growth path of between 3 to 5%, which is a lot more than what it currently is at 1%. So I could go on forever because I am a former politician.
I know you could, but we have to wind it down for this time, and I appreciate yours and everyone's passion. It's been an extremely, I think, enlightening conversation. My co-host Stefano or Allsource had to drop off, but I really recommend you to check out the resources above in the Nest. And I think, just a couple of quick takeaways from me. It's not lost to me the irony of me being, with my accent, the host of this very topical conversation. But having lived abroad in Africa for a couple of years, I really have become appreciative of the challenges, I think, of racial inequality and systemic sort of issues of this type, not just within South Africa, but across the continent. And I think, South Africa is a symbol of what many countries and different communities across the continent face. And the land reform patriarchy, the bill is a sort of, we say, a symbolism of this deeper issue. So I look forward to discussing it more, and hopefully these spaces being a source of constructivism for you guys listening, but also those participating, and to formulate, more connections and dialogue than divisions and dispute. But yeah, thanks everyone. We wish you a great rest of your evening and week, and we'll keep this in our perspectives and cover it again soon. Take care, everyone.